You know, we went to Vietnam without any desire to capture territory or to impose American will on other people. We went there to defend the freedom of the South Vietnamese. And I don't feel that we ought to apologize or to castigate ourselves or to assume the status of culpability.
The Vietnam War, one of the longest and most controversial conflicts in modern history, lasted over 2 decades, cost millions of lives, and left deep scars on global politics, society, and memory. But how did it start? In the mid-19th century, Vietnam was colonized by France and became part of French Indochina. For decades, the Vietnamese people resisted colonial rule. During World War II, Japan occupied Vietnam, weakening French control. In 1945, as Japan surrendered, Vietnamese revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
Một dân tộc đã gan gốc chống hết nô lệ của Pháp hơn 80 năm nay. Một dân tộc đã gan gốc đứng vì phe đồng minh chống phát xít mấy năm nay. Dân tộc đó phải được tự do, phải được độc lập.
However, France, determined to retain control, returned and clashed with Ho Chi Minh's forces, the Viet Minh. What followed was the First Indochina War, ending in the French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Following the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was divided into 2 separate states, the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South under Emperor Bao Dai, who was soon replaced by President Ngo Dinh Diem in a controversial 1955 referendum.
The victory at Dien Bien Phu gives the Viet Minh bargaining power at a peace conference in Geneva. They get all of Vietnam north of the 17th parallel, with Hanoi their capital.
Diem refused to hold the nationwide elections promised by the Geneva Accords, fearing communist victory. His authoritarian rule, favoritism towards Catholics, and persecution of Buddhists led to widespread resentment. In response, the North supported the formation of the National Liberation Front, NLF, known in the South as the Viet Cong, a guerrilla movement aiming to reunify the country under communism. Between 1957 and 1963, South Vietnam became increasingly unstable. The Viet Cong waged an insurgency, assassinating officials and launching attacks. Diem's regime grew more unpopular, culminating in the 1963 Buddhist crisis, where images of monks self-immolating in protest shocked the world. Later that year, Diem was overthrown and killed in a coup approved by the United States. While the U.S. had provided economic and military aid to the French during the First Indochina War, its direct involvement in Vietnam grew after 1954. Under President Eisenhower, the U.S. sent military advisors and aid to support the South Vietnamese government. By 1961, under President Kennedy, American presence increased further, with over 16,000 military advisors and personnel deployed in South Vietnam. These advisors trained South Vietnamese troops and participated in counterinsurgency efforts, though not yet in full combat roles. As the Cold War escalated, Vietnam became a key battleground in the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, received significant support from the Soviet Union and China in the form of weapons, military training, and economic aid.
If we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
The United States, viewing Vietnam through the lens of the domino theory, the belief that if one country in a region fell to communism, neighboring nations would follow, intensified its support for South Vietnam. Even after the assassination of President Diem in 1963, political instability in the South failed to deter U.S. involvement. By 1964, U.S. military advisors were increasingly involved in combat operations, often accompanying South Vietnamese forces on missions. The situation dramatically escalated after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, where 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, reportedly attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats, provided the Johnson administration with the rationale for deeper intervention.
The initial attack on the destroyer Maddox on August 2nd was repeated today by a number of hostile vessels attacking 2 U.S. destroyers with torpedoes. the destroyers and supporting aircraft acted at once on the orders I gave after the initial act of aggression.
Although the facts surrounding the incident remain controversial, it led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by Congress almost unanimously, granting President Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. With this resolution, the Vietnam War transitioned from an advisory mission to a full-scale conflict. In 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang. The American military presence surged quickly, from 23,000 troops in 1964 to over 184,000 by the end of 1965. The U.S. began sustained bombing of North Vietnam under Operation Rolling Thunder and initiated large-scale ground operations in the South. At this point, America was no longer just supporting South Vietnam, it was fighting the war. The years between 1965 and 1968 marked the peak of American military involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, with numbers reaching over 500,000 by 1969. American strategy focused on search and destroy missions, finding and eliminating Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units in the field. But unlike previous wars, Vietnam had no clear front lines. The enemy could be anywhere, hidden in villages, jungles, or vast underground tunnels. Guerrilla tactics, booby traps, and ambushes constantly challenged U.S. troops. In response, the U.S. military employed overwhelming firepower, including heavy artillery, helicopter gunships, and B-52 bombers. Operation Rolling Thunder, launched in 1965, aimed to cripple North Vietnam's infrastructure and supply lines, but the bombing failed to break the enemy's resolve. Meanwhile, the use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange and napalm led to horrific consequences for both the Vietnamese population and American soldiers, many of whom suffered long-term health effects. The Viet Cong, supported logistically by the Ho Chi Minh Trail, an elaborate network of supply routes running through Laos and Cambodia, proved resilient and difficult to eliminate. Despite superior firepower, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces struggled to maintain control of rural areas. Back in the U.S., the war sparked growing unrest. Graphic television footage and rising American casualties, over 30,000 by 1968, fueled anti-war protests. Prominent figures, including Martin Luther King Jr., began speaking out against the conflict. Then came the turning point.
I'm feeling torn and grizzly bear, so like a flying to the air. Where the in my arms, you better beware. I go insane 'cause I gave me dare like a tire. Ooh, like a tire.
The Tet Offensive. On January 30th, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong launched a coordinated surprise attack on over 100 cities and military targets across South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Although American and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the offensive and inflicted heavy losses on the attackers, the scale and coordination of the assault shocked the American public. The Tet Offensive exposed a critical gap between official claims of progress and the war's brutal reality. Public trust in the government eroded, and support for the war sharply declined. Journalist Walter Cronkite famously concluded,
"For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could."
The U.S. may have won the battle, but it had lost the narrative. Facing mounting public opposition and political pressure, President Richard Nixon initiated a policy called Vietnamization. Announced in 1969, it aimed to reduce American involvement by shifting combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. At the same time, Nixon expanded the war effort beyond Vietnam's borders, authorizing secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos to target North Vietnamese supply lines. These actions, later revealed to the public, ignited a firestorm of protests and further eroded trust in the government. One such protest led to the tragic Kent State shootings in 1970, where National Guard troops killed 4 student demonstrators. Despite ongoing peace negotiations in Paris, the war dragged on. In 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, testing the strength of the South Vietnamese military. With American air support, the offensive was repelled, but the fighting made clear that a political solution was the only way forward. In January 1973, the United States, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement called for a ceasefire, U.S. troop withdrawal, and the return of prisoners of war. While the accords officially ended direct American involvement, fighting between North and South Vietnam continued. Without American military support, South Vietnam struggled to hold back the North. Corruption, low morale, and economic instability plagued the Southern government. Meanwhile, the North steadily advanced. In March 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive final offensive. City after city fell with little resistance. On April 30th, 1975, tanks rolled into Saigon, and the South Vietnamese government surrendered. Images of desperate evacuations from the U.S. Embassy rooftop became iconic symbols of the war's tragic end. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war was over, but its legacy had just begun. For Vietnam, the aftermath included years of economic hardship, international isolation, and the long-term effects of chemical warfare. But in time, the nation rebuilt. In 1986, Vietnam initiated a series of economic reforms known as Doi Moi, transitioning from a centrally planned economy to a socialist-oriented market economy. In 1995, 2 decades after the fall of Saigon, the United States and Vietnam officially normalized diplomatic relations. Since then, the 2 nations have grown closer economically and strategically, with expanding trade, investment, and educational exchange. Today, Vietnam is one of Southeast Asia's fastest-growing economies. Its cities are booming, its workforce is young and dynamic, and it plays a key role in regional politics and global supply chains. The shadow of war remains, but so does resilience, reconciliation, and progress.